Sandra nodded, her hands still trembling. She couldn't believe this was happening. How had her life turned upside down so quickly? And more importantly, what had Miss Carla been doing with Jaden all these weeks? As the officers moved to secure the perimeter, Sandra sat down on the couch with Jaden, holding him close. "We're going to be okay," she murmured, though she wasn't sure who she was trying to convince, him or herself. But even as she said it, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Miss Carla's car might be empty now, but Sandra knew deep down that this wasn't the last they'd see of her. As Sandra sat with Jaden on the couch, holding him tightly, her mind raced. The officers were still outside, inspecting the area, their flashlights sweeping over the quiet street. Every creak of the house and rustle of leaves outside sent a jolt through her. She kept glancing at the window, half expecting Miss Carla to appear from the shadows. The thought of that woman anywhere near her son made her stomach churn. Jaden had grown quiet, his small fingers clutching Sandra's shirt as he leaned against her. She stroked his hair gently, trying to calm him down, but he still felt tense, his little body wound up like a spring. Sandra knew she had to stay strong for him, but the questions swirling in her mind were relentless. Who was Miss Carla, really? How could someone who seemed so kind turn out to be so unsettling? And what exactly was the game she'd been playing with Jaden? Before she could spiral too deeply into her thoughts, Officer Riley stepped back inside. He seemed cautious but calm as he approached her. "We didn't find anything unusual outside except for the car. It's locked and there's no sign of her nearby. But we'll stay on the street for a while, just to be safe. If she does show up, we'll handle it." Sandra nodded, grateful for their presence, but still unable to shake the unease creeping through her. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "I just don't understand why she would come back here. She knows I'd be home by now. It doesn't make any sense." Officer Riley frowned, his expression thoughtful. Sometimes people like her, if they feel cornered, will try to intimidate or keep control over a situation. It's possible she parked here on purpose to scare you, but she might not actually be nearby. Sandra didn't find the explanation reassuring. If anything, it only deepened the sense of dread. Why would Miss Carla want to intimidate her? What had she been hiding this whole time? Jaden suddenly pulled away from her and looked up at Officer Riley, his wide eyes glistening. "She's not nice," he said firmly, his voice trembling. "She always pretended to be nice when Mommy was around, but when it was just me, she got mad a lot." Sandra's heart ached hearing her son say this. She hated herself for not noticing sooner, for not asking more questions before. She had trusted this woman with the most precious thing in her life, and now that trust was shattered. "Do you remember anything else about what she did?" Officer Riley asked Jaden gently. "Anything strange that might help us figure out what's going on?" Jaden hesitated, glancing at Sandra as if looking for permission. She nodded, encouraging him to speak. Sometimes she would sit on the floor and close her eyes. She said she was doing something called, he scrunched his face, trying to recall. Meditating. But it didn't feel like the meditating we learned about in school. It was scary. She would whisper stuff, and she told me I wasn't allowed to watch. She said it was a secret. Sandra exchanged a glance with Officer Riley, her stomach tightening further. There was something deeply unsettling about Jaden's description. Meditation wasn't inherently strange, but the way Jaden described it, the secrecy, the fear, made it sound like something else entirely. She tried to push the thought from her mind, but it lingered, gnawing at her. Sandra stared at the note in Officer Hernandez's hand, her stomach twisting into tighter knots. The jagged handwriting, the ominous message, it felt like a direct challenge, one meant to unnerve her completely. And it was working. She held Jaden closer, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. Who was behind this? Was it really Miss Carla? Or had she unknowingly invited something even darker into their lives? The officers stayed longer this time, checking every room and securing all entry points before reluctantly heading back to their patrol car. "We'll stay close. Officer Riley reassured her. "But I need you to call us the second anything else happens, no matter how small it seems." Sandra nodded, her throat too tight to respond. She locked the door behind them, double-checking the latch before drawing the curtains. The house felt suffocating now, the air thick with fear. She tried to keep her composure for Jaden's sake, but the weight of the night pressed down on her, relentless and unforgiving. Jaden tugged on her sleeve, his eyes wide and filled with worry. "Mummy, is Miss Carla going to come back?" he asked softly. Sandra crouched down to his level, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "I don't know, baby," she admitted, her voice trembling despite her efforts to stay calm. "But I promise, I'll do everything I can to keep you safe." Jaden hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering his voice as if he were afraid someone might overhear. "There's something else I didn't tell you," he whispered. Sandra's heart skipped a beat. "What is it, sweetheart?" she asked gently, though her pulse quickened with anticipation. Jaden glanced toward the kitchen, his little hands gripping her arm. "When Miss Carla was meditating, she said she was talking to someone. I asked her who, but she just smiled and said it was her special friend. She said he knew things about me, about you, and that he could make things happen." Sandra felt a chill run down her spine. Did she ever say who this friend was? Jaden shook his head. "No." But sometimes she looked at the door, like she was waiting for someone to come in. She said he liked to visit at night. The words kicked Sandra like a punch to the gut. 1,000 thoughts flooded her mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Was this some kind of twisted game Miss Carla was playing? Or was there something deeper, something more sinister, behind her behavior? Suddenly, a soft thud echoed from upstairs. Sandra froze, her breath catching in her throat. Jaden clung to her, his little fingers digging into her arm. "What was that?" he whispered. "I don't know," Sandra replied, her voice barely audible. She grabbed the kitchen knife she had left on the counter and motioned for Jaden to stay close. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to move, step by step, toward the staircase. The house was eerily silent as they climbed the stairs, the faint creak of each step making Sandra's heart race. When they reached the top, she paused, listening intently. The thud had come from her bedroom, and the door was slightly ajar. A sliver of moonlight spilled through the window, casting long shadows across the hallway. Sandra pushed the door open slowly, her grip tightening on the knife. The room was empty, the bed undisturbed. She checked the closet, then the bathroom, but there was no sign of anyone or anything out of place. Yet the unease in her chest refused to fade. Just as she turned to leave, her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She pulled it out and saw another message from the unknown number. This one was even shorter than the last. *check under the bed*. Her stomach lurched. She glanced at Jaden, who stood in the doorway, his eyes wide with fear. "Stay there," she whispered, her voice trembling. She took a deep breath and crouched down, peering under the bed. At first, she saw nothing but shadows. Then her phone buzzed again, the light from the screen illuminating something tucked against the far corner, a small, weathered notebook. Sandra's hands shook as she reached for it, pulling it out carefully. The cover was scratched and worn, and the pages were filled with the same jagged handwriting as the note downstairs. She flipped through it, her breath catching as she recognized some of the entries. They were about Jaden, his routines, his favorite toys, the times he usually fell asleep. Every detail was recorded in unsettling precision. Jaden pointed again, his small hand shaking. "I saw her car, Mummy. It's outside." Sandra's stomach churned as she looked harder, and sure enough, parked a little further down the street, was Miss Carla's beat-up white sedan. The sight of it sent a shiver up her spine. Why was she here? Miss Carla always left right after Sandra got home. There was no reason for her to still be in the neighborhood, let alone parked near their house. Sandra felt her protective instincts kick into overdrive. Something was very wrong. Stay here, she said softly to Jaden, trying to mask the fear in her voice. She reached for her phone, which she had left on the counter when she ran back into the room. Her fingers shook as she dialed the police again, her voice firmer this time. She's outside, Sandra told the operator. The babysitter. She's parked near my house, and I'm scared. The operator assured her that officers were on their way, urging Sandra to stay inside and keep herself and her son safe. Sandra hung up and immediately locked the front door, then checked all the windows to make sure they were secure. Jaden followed her closely, clutching at her shirt like a lifeline. His earlier confession hung heavy in the air between them, and Sandra's mind raced as she tried to piece everything together. She crouched down to Jaden's level, taking his hands in hers. Baby, I need you to tell me more about what happened tonight. What did Miss Carla do? Why are you so scared? Jaden bit his lip, looking down at his feet. For a moment, Sandra thought he might not answer, but then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. She got mad, Mommy. I didn't want to play her game, and she said I had to. Sandra's blood ran cold. What game, Jaden? His little brow furrowed as he tried to explain. It's not like a fun game. It's weird. She makes me sit on the couch and not move, and she says things like magic words or something. And if I move or say I'm bored, she gets mad. She said if I told you, I get in big trouble. Sandra's stomach flipped. None of this made any sense, but the fear in her son's voice was unmistakable. She pulled him close, holding him tightly as if her embrace alone could shield him from whatever had happened. You're not in trouble, she whispered. You did the right thing by telling me. A knock on the door startled both of them. Sandra's heart leaped into her throat as she froze, unsure of what to do. Was it Miss Carla? Or the police? She grabbed her phone again, ready to call 911 if needed. Peeking through the peephole, she breathed a small sigh of relief when she saw two uniformed officers standing on her porch. She quickly opened the door, letting them in and locking it behind them. Thank you for coming, she said, her voice still shaky. I don't know what's going on, but I'm really scared. The officers introduced themselves, Officer Riley and Officer Hernandez, and listened carefully as Sandra explained everything. She told them about Jaden's unsettling comments, the strange game Miss Carla had been making him play, and the fact that her car was now parked outside. Officer Hernandez glanced out the window, frowning when he spotted the car. We'll take a look, he said. But first, we'd like to talk to your son, if that's okay. Sandra hesitated, glancing at Jaden. She didn't want to scare him further, but she also knew the officers needed to hear his side of the story. She nodded, crouching down to reassure him. It's okay, baby. These nice officers just want to help us. You can tell them what you told me. Jaden nodded hesitantly, clinging to Sandra's hand as he recounted the strange events of the evening. The officers listened intently, their expressions growing more serious with each passing moment. When he was finished, Officer Riley knelt down to Jaden's level, giving him a reassuring smile. You're a very brave boy, he said. Thank you for telling us. As they talked, Sandra's anxiety only grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than she or Jaden understood. Miss Carla had always seemed so normal, so trustworthy. But now, all Sandra could think about was the unease she'd felt in her gut the first time they met. The way Carla had been almost too eager to take the job, her overly sweet demeanor that now seemed forced in hindsight. Officer Hernandez excused himself to step outside and check on the car. A few moments later, he returned, his expression grim. The car is empty, he said, but it's definitely hers. We'll stay here for a while, just in case she comes back. In the meantime, I suggest you don't contact her directly. Let us handle it. But even as she said it, Sandra couldn't shake the feeling that Miss Carla wasn't done. The message wasn't just a threat, it was a warning, and Sandra had no idea what was coming next. The hours crawled by, each one more nerve-wracking than the last. The officers stayed outside, their presence somewhat reassuring, but not enough to ease the dread Sandra felt deep in her gut. She couldn't sleep, couldn't relax, not when every instinct told her danger was still lurking. Then, just after midnight, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, and Sandra's heart leaped into her throat. She fumbled for her phone, using its flashlight to navigate. Jaden, who had fallen asleep on the couch, stirred and sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Why's it dark, Mommy?" he asked groggily. "It's just the power, sweetheart," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Probably the wind knocked something out. But even as she said it, her mind raced with possibilities. What if it wasn't an accident? What if Miss Carla was behind it? She moved quickly to the window, peeking out to check on the officers. Their flashlights were moving through the street, but they seemed just as confused as she was. She could hear them talking on their radios, their voices urgent but indistinct. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, barely audible over the pounding of Sandra's heart. She froze, clutching Jaden close as she strained to hear. Another knock followed, louder this time, coming from the back door. Sandra's breath hitched. No one ever used the back door, and it was surrounded by dense trees, making it almost impossible to see from the street. Whoever was knocking knew exactly how to avoid being spotted. Her phone vibrated in her hand, and she glanced down to see another call from the unknown number. She didn't answer, but the voicemail notification came seconds later. Against her better judgment, she played it. "Open the door," the voice said, calm and deliberate. "You know you can't hide forever." Sandra's stomach twisted as she clutched Jaden tighter. Her mind raced. She couldn't open the door, but she also couldn't ignore the fact that Miss Carla, or whoever it was escalating. Sandra grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter, her hands trembling as she tried to steady her breathing. She needed to protect Jaden, no matter what. She moved cautiously toward the back door, staying just out of sight. The knocking had stopped, but the silence was even more unnerving. She peeked through the edge of the curtain, but the darkness outside was impenetrable. Whoever had been knocking was either gone or hiding. A sudden loud bang at the front door made her jump. It wasn't a knock this time. It was forceful, almost like someone trying to break in. The officers outside shouted, their flashlights now aimed at the house. Sandra's phone buzzed again, this time a text from the unknown number. Asterisk, "I'm closer than you think, asterisk." Her blood ran cold. The officers were now running toward the house, their radios crackling as they called for backup. Sandra stepped back from the door, pulling Jaden behind her. The sound of shattering glass from the kitchen made her scream, and she turned just in time to see a shadow move through the broken window. "Stay behind me," she shouted, gripping the knife tightly as she faced the intruder. But the shadow was gone as quickly as it appeared, disappearing into the darkness of the house. The front door burst open, and the officers rushed in, their flashlights sweeping through the living room. Sandra's chest heaved as she pointed toward the kitchen. Someone broke in. They went that way. The officers moved swiftly, their voices low and tense as they cleared the house. Sandra held Jaden tightly, her mind racing. Had it been Miss Carla? Or was it someone else? And why were they doing this? The officers returned a few minutes later, their expressions grim. "Whoever it was, they're gone," Officer Hernandez said. "But they left this." He held up a piece of paper, its edges torn and jagged. Scrawled in messy handwriting was a single sentence. Asterisk, "You can't protect him, asterisk." Sandra's knees nearly gave out as she read the note. The tension, the fear, it was all built into something, and she felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to give way beneath her. Whatever was happening, it was far from over. "Did she ever hurt you, Jaden?" Officer Riley asked softly. Jaden shook his head quickly. "No, but sometimes she grabbed my arm if I didn't listen. It hurt a little, but I wasn't really hurt." Sandra's fists clenched, anger bubbling up inside her. Even the thought of Miss Carla laying a hand on Jaden made her blood boil. She wanted answers, and she wanted them now. The sound of a car engine outside interrupted her thoughts. Both officers immediately tensed, their hands moving toward their holsters. Sandra's pulse raced as she peeked through the window. A dark SUV was slowly driving down the street, its headlights casting long shadows against the houses. It didn't stop, but Sandra couldn't shake the feeling that it had been moving too slowly, as if someone was watching. The officers stepped outside again, their radios crackling as they communicated with someone on the other end. Sandra stayed inside, clutching Jaden close, her heart pounding as she watched their movements through the window. The SUV turned the corner and disappeared, but the unease it left behind was palpable. When the officers came back inside, Officer Hernandez's expression was grim. "The car's gone, but it's worth noting. We'll file a report and keep an eye out for it." Sandra nodded, but her anxiety was far from eased. "Do you think she's in that car, watching us?" "We can't say for sure," Officer Hernandez replied, "but it's possible. We're going to keep patrolling the area tonight, just in case." Sandra thanked them again, but the weight of the situation pressed heavily on her shoulders. She tried to distract herself by making tea, her hands still shaking as she poured the water. Jaden sat at the kitchen table, quietly coloring in one of his superhero books, but even he seemed unusually subdued. As the night dragged on, Sandra couldn't help but replay the events in her mind, looking for anything she might have missed. The eerie games, the strange meditations, the sudden anger, none of it added up. And then there was the matter of the SUV. Was it connected to Miss Carla, or was it just an eerie coincidence? Sandra's phone buzzed on the counter, making her jump. She grabbed it quickly, half expecting another text from Miss Carla, but it was from her neighbor, Mrs. Johnson. The message was short but chilling. "Hey Sandra, everything okay? I saw a strange car parked near your house earlier. Looked like someone was sitting inside. Thought you should know. Sandra's grip on the phone tightened, her breath hitching. Whoever had been in that car wasn't just driving by, they had been watching. Sandra's pulse raced as she reread Mrs. Johnson's text, her mind spinning. Someone had been watching the house, possibly even before she got home. The thought made her feel exposed, vulnerable. Every creak of the house and rustle of wind outside seemed amplified, as if the walls weren't enough to keep them safe. She instinctively looked over at Jaden, who was now sitting on the couch, flipping through his book, but glancing at her every so often. His wide eyes told her he sensed her fear. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her attention back. This time, it was an unknown number. Sandra stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the answer button. Could it be Miss Carla? She debated whether to answer but decided against it, letting the call go to voicemail. Her nerves were already stretched thin, and she couldn't risk being thrown off further. Moments later, the voicemail notification popped up. Sandra hesitated, but finally pressed play. The message was short and haunting. A woman's voice, low and calm, said, "You should have stayed quiet." The line went dead. Sandra's knees nearly buckled. Her chest tightened as she clutched the phone, staring at it in disbelief. There was no doubt in her mind that it was Miss Carla. The voice, the tone, it was her. But how had she gotten Sandra's number? And what did she mean by staying quiet? The implications sent chills down her spine. Sandra quickly showed the voicemail to Officer Relly, who had just stepped back inside. His jaw tightened as he listened, and his hand instinctively moved to his radio. "This changes things," he said firmly. "We need to escalate this. She's clearly trying to intimidate you." "What does she want?" Sandra asked, her voice shaking. "Why would she do this?" "We'll find out," Riley assured her. "But for now, stay inside, keep the doors locked, and don't answer any calls unless you know who it is. We're going to get some backup to patrol the area tonight." Jaden, sensing the tension, came over and hugged Sandra's leg. "Mommy, are we going to be okay?" he asked softly, his voice trembling. Sandra knelt down and hugged him tightly. "Of course, baby," she said, but her own fear made her words feel hollow. "The police are here to protect us. Everything will be fine." But even as she said it, Sandra couldn't shake the feeling that Miss Carla wasn't done. It was a chilly evening in the small suburban neighborhood where streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on quiet houses. The smell of rain lingered in the air, and the faint hum of crickets played in the background as Sandra juggled the chaos of a typical weeknight. Sandra, a single mom in her early 30s, had just come home from a long shift at the diner, her feet aching and her mind racing with the endless tasks of parenthood. Her son, 6-year-old Jaden, was sitting cross-legged on a living room rug, his curly hair slightly disheveled and his favorite superhero action figure clutched tightly in one hand. His brown eyes sparkled with a kind of innocence only a child could possess, but tonight, something about his demeanor felt off. Jaden had always been a bright and chatty little boy. He loved telling stories, most of them filled with dragons, treasure maps, and heroic adventures. But as Sandra kicked off her shoes and settled into the couch, Jaden's quietness struck her as unusual. Normally, he'd be bombarding her with tales from his day or showing off his latest crayon masterpiece. Instead, he seemed hesitant, almost as if he were waiting for the right moment to say something. Sandra noticed the slight furrow in his brow and decided to prod gently. "Jaden, how was your evening with Miss Carla?" she asked, referring to the babysitter who had been watching him for the past few months. Miss Carla came highly recommended by a neighbor, and while she seemed reliable and kind, Sandra couldn't shake the feeling that Jaden wasn't as thrilled with her as Sandra had hoped. Jaden hesitated, shifting his gaze to the carpet. "She did it again," he mumbled under his breath, so quietly Sandra almost missed it. Sandra froze, her heart skipping a beat. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing in concern. "What do you mean, baby? What did Miss Carla do?" Jaden looked up at her, his small hands clutching the action figure even tighter. "The thing," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "She said not to tell, but I think you need to know." The room seemed to close in around Sandra as a wave of unease washed over her. What was he talking about? What could Miss Carla possibly have done to make him this nervous? Sandra's mind raced through possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Jaden wasn't the type to make things up. He was an honest and straightforward kid. The weight of his words pressed on her chest, and she knew she had to get to the bottom of this. "Jaden," she said, keeping her voice calm despite the alarm bells ringing in her head, "you can tell Mommy anything. You're not in trouble. Just tell me what happened." Jaden glanced around the room, as if he were afraid someone might be listening. Then, in a trembling voice, he began to recount what had unfolded while Sandra was away. As he spoke, Sandra's heart sank deeper with every word. Just as Jaden reached a critical part of the story, Sandra's phone buzzed on the coffee table, jolting her out of the moment. It was a text from Miss Carla, asking if she had made it home safely. Sandra stared at the screen, her stomach churning. Her instincts screamed that something wasn't right. She picked up the phone but didn't reply. "Jaden," she said firmly, her eyes locking onto his. "Stay right here. I'm going to make a quick call." Grabbing her phone, Sandra stepped into the kitchen, her hands trembling as she dialed 911. What Jaden had just told her was too serious to ignore, and Sandra knew she couldn't take any chances. The operator's voice came through the line. 911, what's your emergency?" Sandra took a deep breath, her voice shaking as she spoke. "I think something might have happened to my son while I was at work. I need someone to come now." Before she could explain further, a loud noise came from the living room. Sandra dropped the phone in shock, her heart racing as she rushed back to find Jaden standing by the window, his eyes wide with fear. "Mom," he whispered, pointing outside, "she's here." Sandra's heart pounded as she hurried to Jaden's side, her breath catching in her throat. She pulled him away from the window, wrapping her arms around his trembling little body. "What do you mean she's here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She glanced out the window, her gaze darting between the shadows outside. The dim streetlights illuminated the sidewalk, but she couldn't see anyone there. The quiet of the neighborhood now felt oppressive, every sound amplified in the stillness of the night. Her hands trembled as she read one of the later entries. Asterisk, he's starting to notice. I'll need to act soon, asterisk. Sandra's chest tightened. This was more than a game, more than a strange obsession. Miss Carla, or whoever was behind this, had been planning something, and they weren't done. A sudden noise from outside made her jump. She rushed to the window and saw a figure standing at the edge of the yard, just beyond the reach of the streetlights. They didn't move, their silhouette barely visible in the darkness. Sandra's heart pounded as she backed away, clutching the notebook tightly. She turned to Jaden, her voice firm despite her fear. "We're leaving," she said. "Right now." "But where will we go?" Jaden asked, his voice trembling. "To the police station," Sandra replied. "We'll be safe there." She grabbed a bag and quickly threw in a few essentials, her hands moving frantically as the urgency of the situation overwhelmed her. She kept glancing out the window, but the figure hadn't moved. It was as if they were waiting, watching. Just as Sandra zipped up the bag, her phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. Asterisk, you can run, but you can't hide, asterisk. Her breath caught, but she didn't stop. With Jaden by her side, she made her way downstairs, her heart pounding with every step. The figure outside was a stark reminder that this wasn't over, not even close. Sandra clutched Jaden's hand tightly as they rushed toward the front door. Her fingers trembled as she unlocked it, every nerve on edge. She glanced outside, expecting to see the shadowy figure still lingering at the edge of the yard. The space was empty. The street lights flickered faintly, casting long, eerie shadows on the pavement. She hesitated for a moment, her instincts telling her the quiet was a trap. But there was no time to second-guess. They had to leave. She grabbed her car keys from a hook by the door and ushered Jaden into the back seat, locking the doors as soon as he was inside. Her hands shook as she started the car, the hum of the engine breaking the suffocating silence. She glanced around the street one last time, her heart racing, and then pulled out of the driveway. The police station wasn't far, just a few miles down the road, but every second felt like an eternity. Jaden was silent in the back seat, clutching his stuffed bear as he watched Sandra with wide, worried eyes. "Mummy," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if she's following us?" Sandra didn't answer immediately, her grip tightening on the wheel. She couldn't let her fear show, not now. "She won't, baby," she said, her voice as steady as she could make it. "The police are going to help us. Everything will be okay." But even as she said the words, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights trailing them, but the road behind her remained dark and empty. Her relief was short-lived when she noticed something ahead. A car parked on the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking. Sandra's heart sank. It was the same dark SUV she'd seen earlier. Her foot hovered over the brake, but she quickly decided against stopping. She swerved slightly to give the car a wide berth and pressed the accelerator, her pulse pounding in her ears. As she passed the SUV, she caught a glimpse of the driver's seat, and her breath caught. It was empty. She barely had time to process the sight when her phone buzzed on the console beside her. She glanced down and saw another message from the unknown number. Asterisk, you're going the wrong way, asterisk. Her stomach flipped. Her eyes darted to the GPS on the dashboard, and for a moment, doubt crept in. Could they really be heading into danger? She shook the thought away. This was exactly what they wanted, to scare her, to make her question herself. She tightened her grip on the wheel and kept driving. The tension in the car was unbearable, the silence broken only by the occasional hum of the tires on the road. Jaden's breathing was shallow and quick, and Sandra knew he was terrified. She tried to focus on the road ahead, but her mind raced with thoughts of the notebook, the messages, and the figure in the yard. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite put together. Then, out of nowhere, the car jerked violently to the side. Sandra screamed as she fought to keep control of the wheel, the vehicle skidding slightly before coming to a stop. Her heart raced as she looked around, trying to understand what had just happened. The road was clear. There was no sign of debris or an animal. It was as if something unseen had forced the car off the road. Before she could react, a shadowy figure emerged from the trees lining the street. Sandra's breath caught as the figure stepped closer, the faint glow of the headlights illuminating their face. It was Miss Carla. She stood there, calm and unflinching, her expression eerily serene. Sandra's chest tightened as she locked eyes with the woman who had been haunting her thoughts for hours. "You can't run from this," Miss Carla said, her voice low but firm. "You don't understand what's at stake." Sandra's anger surged, momentarily overpowering her fear. She threw open the car door and stepped out, keeping a safe distance but refusing to back down. "Stay away from my son," she shouted, her voice trembling with rage. "I don't know what you want, but you're not going to hurt him." Miss Carla tilted her head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I don't want to hurt him," she said, her tone almost soothing. "I've been trying to protect him. From them asterisk." Sandra froze, her mind reeling. "What are you talking about? Who's them?" Before Miss Carla could answer, a deafening sound filled the air, a screech of tires and blaring horns. Sandra turned just in time to see another car barreling toward them, its headlights blinding. She barely had time to react before the car swerved and crashed into the SUV, sending shards of metal and glass flying. Sandra shielded her face, her heart pounding as she turned back to Miss Carla, but she was gone. Sandra ran back to the car, flinging open the door and checking on Jaden, who was huddled in the back seat, unharmed but shaken. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, though her voice betrayed her panic. "We're okay." The sound of sirens in the distance brought a glimmer of hope. The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights illuminating the chaotic scene. Sandra explained everything as best she could, though her account felt disjointed and surreal even to her own ears. The officers searched the area, but there was no sign of Miss Carla or anyone else. As Sandra sat in the back of a police car with Jaden, clutching him tightly, her phone buzzed one last time. She hesitated, dread washing over her, before finally looking at the screen. The message read, "You don't see the whole picture yet, but you will asterisk." Sandra's breath hitched, her mind spinning with unanswered questions. She glanced down at Jaden, who was now asleep in her arms, and made a silent vow. Whatever this was, whatever danger still lingered, she would stop at nothing to protect him.